greater amount of bodily suffering. Society is asking, then, to denude itself of an instrument of punishment which, in the grave cases to which alone it is suitable, effects its purpose at a less cost of human suffering than any other; which, while it inspires more terror, is less cruel in actual fact than any punishment which we should think of substituting for it. My honourable friend says that it does not inspire terror, and that experience proves it to be a failure. But the influence of a punishment is not to be estimated by its effect on hardened criminals. Those whose habitual way of life keeps them, so to speak, at all times within sight of the gallows, do grow to care less about it, as, to compare good things with bad, an old soldier is not much afflicted by the chance of dying in battle. I cannot afford to admit that it is often said about the indifference of professional criminals to the gallows, though of that indifference 1/3 is probably bravado, and another third confidence that they shall have the luck to escape. It is quite probable that the remaining third is real. But the efficacy of a punishment which acts principally through the imagination is chiefly to be measured by the impression it makes on those who are still innocent, by the horror with which it surrounds the first promptings of guilt, the restraining influence it exercises over the beginning of the thought which, if indulged, would become a temptation, the check which it exerts over the graded declination towards the state, never suddenly attained, in which crime no longer revolts, and punishment no longer terrifies. As for what is called the failure of death punishment, who is able to judge of that? We partly know who those are whom it has not deterred, but who is there who knows whom it has deterred, or how many human beings it has saved who would have lived to be murderers if that awful association had not been thrown around the idea of murder from their earliest infancy? Let us not forget that the most important fact loses its power over the imagination if it is made too cheap. When a punishment fit only for the most atrocious crimes is lavished on small offences until human feeling recoils from it, then indeed it ceases to intimidate, because it ceases to be believed in. The failure of capital punishment in cases of theft is easily accounted for. The thief did not believe that it would be inflicted. He had learned by experience that jurors would perjure themselves rather than find him guilty, that judges would seize any excuse for not sentencing him to death, or for recommending him to mercy, and that if neither juror nor judges were merciful, there were still hopes from an authority above both. When things had come to this pass, it was high time to give up the vain attempt. When it is impossible to inflict a punishment, or when its infliction becomes a public scandal, the idle threat cannot too soon disappear from the statute book. And in the case of the host of offences which were formerly capital, I heartily rejoice that it did become impracticable to execute the law. If the same state of public feeling comes to exist in the case of murder, if the time comes when jurors refuse to find a murderer guilty, when judges will not sentence him to death, or will recommend him to mercy, or when, if juries and judges do not inflict from their duty, home secretaries, under pressure of deputations and memorials, shrink from theirs, and the threat becomes, as it became in the other cases, a mere Bertram fulmen, then indeed it may become necessary to do in this case what has been done in those, to abrogate this penalty. That time may come. My honourable friend thinks that it has nearly come. I hardly know whether he lamented it or boasted of it, but he and his friends are entitled to the boast, for if it comes it will be their doing, and they will have gained what I cannot but call a fatal victory, for they will have achieved it by bringing about, if they will forgive me for saying so, an enervation, an effeminacy in the general mind of the country. For what else than effeminacy is it to be much more shocked by taking a man's life than by depriving him of all that makes life desirable or valuable? Is death then the greatest of all earthly ills? Usque adenon more miseram est. Is it indeed so dreadful a thing to die? Has it not been from of old one chief part of a manly education to make us despise death, teaching us to account it, if an evil at all, by no means high on the list of evils, in all events as an inevitable one, and to hold, as it were, our lives in our hands, ready to be given or risked at any moment for a sufficiently worthy object? I am sure that my honourable friends know all this as well, and have as much of all these feelings as any of the rest of us, possibly more. But I cannot think that this is likely to be the effect of their teaching on the general mind. I cannot think that the cultivating of a peculiar sensitiveness of conscience on this one point, over and above what results from the general cultivation of the moral sentiments, is permanently consistent with assigning in our own minds to the fact of death no more than the degree of relative importance which belongs to it among the other incidents of our humanity. The men of old cared too little about death, and gave their own lives or took those of others with equal recklessness. Our danger is of the opposite kind, lest we should be so much shocked by death in general and in the abstract, as to care too much about it in individual cases, both those of other people and of our own, which call for its being risked. And I am not putting things at the worst, for it is proved by the experience of other countries that honour of the executioner by no means necessarily implies honour of the assassin. The stronghold, as we all know, of hired assassination in the 18th century was Italy. Yet it is sad that in some of the Italian populations the infliction of death by sentence of law was in the highest degree offensive and revolting to popular feeling. Much has been said of the sanctity of human life, and the absurdity of supposing that we can teach respect for life by ourselves destroying it. But I am surprised at the employment of this argument, for it is one which might be brought against any punishment whatever. It is not human life only, not human life as such, that ought to be sacred to us, but human feelings.